Yours.
There we are. Right, good afternoon, everybody. The quiet spot. So here we go, last one of the day before we all get to go and have our feast. Now, what do we know about Britain? The Amesbury Archer. That's about the only decent burial we have, apart from the Boscombe Bowman that was mentioned briefly by Franco yesterday. But otherwise, what else is going for Britain? Because, let's face it, it's the end of the line, along with Ireland. Apologies to Neil as well. So, we're right on the margins. What possibly could be interesting about Britain in terms of the Beaker phenomenon? Worse than that, in the run-up to the arrival of Beaker in Britain, we have almost 1,000 years of apparent cultural isolation. We have no evidence of materials crossing that channel, of styles being shared on either side of it. I mean, who in their right minds would isolate themselves from Europe? It is completely irrational, impossible to explain. Of course, I excuse Ireland from this because Ireland did indeed maintain long-distance contacts with passage tomb communities down the Atlantic coast as far as Iberia. But just across those 22 miles of sea, 30 kilometers of sea, we have virtually no evidence of interaction in terms of material cultural styles. And of course, Mark knows all about this, having contributed to that particular publication. Recently, Dan Bradley's DNA team in Trinity College Dublin have published this article. Don't be fooled, although the title is all about Malta, he actually has there are some very important data about the degree of genetic exchange across Europe throughout the Neolithic. And what they found quite extraordinary was that one of the main barriers, which I've outlined in red there, is actually between Britain and Ireland and the rest of the continent. So that does seem to support the picture that we've been getting from the archaeological evidence. But of course, this isolation leads to backwardness. We have metallurgy only appearing in Britain with Beaker arrival, so it seems. And the other vital invention of prehistory, the wheel, is everywhere in Europe, but it's not in Britain because of that isolation. Dear, oh dear, oh dear. Worse than that, large-scale infrastructures begun and then abandoned midway. Large projects overrunning. How could that be? Yes. Does that ring any bells with what we're seeing with our hopeless Conservative government in Britain at the moment? But enough of the fun. Let's talk about what may have happened in the past. And we're very lucky because in radiocarbon terms, there is a crucial calibration peak around 2500 to 2470 BC that basically radiocarbon dates fall one side or the other of that peak. And what we have found with our extensive dating program and Bayesian modeling of all of those Beaker dates is that they just do not start before that date of around 2475 BC. So that gives us a very clear idea of when we see the Beaker burial rite visible in Britain. Now, it's very tempting to say, therefore, that means that there were no Beaker people in Britain before that time range. Now, I've had a lifetime studying the archaeology of death, and I know that we are looking at a tiny proportion of the people that lived in prehistory that receive receive burial or otherwise archaeologically visible rites. The vast majority of people in European prehistory have left no archaeological trace, and we must never forget that. We are only looking at a tiny, tiny proportion of the people that lived. We have a chronology largely developed by Stuart Needham in the last 20 years, and we consider that we have one of the shortest Chalcolithics in Europe, a period of no more than 300 years, from notionally the beginning of that Beaker period, 2450, 2500, through until around 200 BC or thereabouts, when we see the alloying of copper with tin, and in large measure. So I won't bore you with the chronology any further. We also have seen something of this slide already. We'll hear more about it on Saturday morning. And of course, the dramatic results of from our geneticist colleagues revealing that we have an exceptional proportion of steppe-derived ancestry in all of our Beaker burials, carrying on through into our Bronze Age inhumations. And a recent paper by Tom Booth and colleagues estimates that we have something like a period of 400 years over 16 generations, where we see a consistency developing in terms of at least those that have survived archaeologically. The spot's pretty much given up, never mind. But where we see a relatively steady mix of steppe-derived ancestry at around 90% and indigenous insular Neolithic farmer DNA at around 10%. That takes us further into the question then of why is it that all of our inhumations and indeed our disarticulated burials as well as articulated ones really fall in this part of the scale on the left side of that illustration, because we have to wonder what has happened to those that have 100% or near enough of insular Neolithic farmer DNA. And Tom Booth and co. have suggested that we might be looking at those that have non-visible funerary rites, or those that have funerary rites not amenable to ancient DNA, primarily cremation, that is where we are seeing the indigenous population. Now, that's a theme that I've followed up with one of my former PhD students, Anna Bloxham, that we published just last year in Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society. And we looked at the assemblages amongst the cremations. And we have to admit that we cannot necessarily claim that the cremated burials are entirely those of the insular population, because we know that cremation was a practice on the near continent in the Netherlands at the same time as bell beaker inhumation. What we can say is that virtually none of our cremations, we count them on the fingers of two hands, that actually have beaker pottery in association. So that most of those cremations are unaccompanied by any ceramics. We have a modest assemblages of grave goods, and by and large they could go either way in saying this is the continuing Neolithic population, or these are what we would call normally bell beaker users who are receiving the cremation rite. So I'm afraid it is horribly ambiguous, and we have no clear image really of being able to say that that Booth and co. are right. I suspect that they may well be right to a degree. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon are these following topics. I want to look at technology, particularly in the 25th century BC, that moment when we see those beaker burials appearing, and in the decades before that. We'll then look at diet and subsistence, population and land use, mobility, technologies of the body, houses and domestic life, and we'll finish off looking at building monuments and organizing the labour for large-scale works. So, ceramics. Our great late Neolithic tradition from the north of Scotland to the south coast is what we call grooved ware. And it has a variety of decorative styles, but interestingly, it never, ever turns up in the same archaeological contexts as bell beaker pottery. So it may be sometimes on the same sites, but we never find them together, for example, in the same pit. They are completely separate in their practices of use and deposition. Yet, looking at their chronological lifetimes, there is enough evidence to suggest that there must have been periods of substantial overlap in time between the two. So, for example, our excavations at Durrington Walls, which recovered the settlement built before the henge, we have an end date somewhere around 2460, 2450 BC. And yet, the Amesbury Archer, we have somewhere 2480 to 2340. There's quite a possibility of overlap between those two. It's more extreme just up the road at Avebury, where we have the palisade enclosures with their grooved ware pottery finishing as late as 2115 to 1865. And yet we have a beaker burial close by, which has to have been complete, the end of that range is at 2200 BC. So we have this question of why do we have the overlap when we know that the two styles are treated separately. Now, what Ros Cleal and Josh Pollard have found recently, and it's taken a while, I guess, to identify this, is that in the Durrington Walls assemblage, which is dated to that period before 2470, so in other words, before those beaker burials, we find traits of application, beaker-like comb and twisted cord, which otherwise have not appeared on grooved-ware pottery until this point. It's not just at Durrington Walls. They found it on a number of final late Neolithic grooved-ware sites. And it's also worth making the point that there is a very strong difference between grooved-ware paste, grooved-ware fabric, and beaker fabric. So at Durrington Walls, we have one sherd from one of our house floors, which is in beaker fabric. Its fingernail decoration, though, is unattributable to either a bell beaker or grooved ware. Now, what is interesting is that around that time, so somewhere around between 2480 and 2460, as the settlement went out of use at Durrington Walls, a large post circle was constructed around the perimeter of the settlement. It's about 400 metres across. And within one of those pits, we found adze marks, and I've ringed them in blue for you. And from their width and from the shallowness of the blade, because of the angle at which they were striking the chalk face, these cannot have been axe heads of stone. They have to have been axe heads of metal, which would have been hafted in an adze arrangement. So I think we can say that at Durrington Walls at that date, they're definitely using copper tools. When we look at the earlier settlement, and again coming back to this data before 2470, it's interesting that our very large lithic assemblage, over 250,000 pieces, not a single flint or stone axe head or even fragment of. Now, for this kind of assemblage in the British Neolithic, for that size, you would expect about 60 axes and axe fragments. So I think I can't believe that they're not using axes, and my suspicion is that they're already using copper axes, which can only have derived from the continent. And what I now wonder is whether we have a contact period which is not actually showing up in the burial record. Now, does that mean they're taking all their dead back across the water or throwing them in the sea? I think what we have to understand is that the practice of actual burial is a major social, ideological, and political statement. And for whatever reason, they simply were not making that kind of statement at that time. Let's take a look now at diet and subsistence. And from the work of Mandy Jay and Mike Richards that we published in 2019, they have shown very comprehensively that from the carbon and nitrogen isotopes that we have quite a strong clustering of dietary from the dietary isotopes, regardless of whatever region within Britain those people were living. So we can see that they're generally consistent across Britain. They're broadly omnivorous with relatively high levels of animal protein, and they're really not interested in marine fish. I just saw today that there's a paper out for Europe about the interest in seaweed eating across Europe from the Mesolithic onwards. So they may have eaten a bit of seaweed, but otherwise they have very depleted carbon-13 levels. Now what's interesting is, this was mentioned by Marie earlier, when we look at the dietary and occupational health, we see that they're broadly worse off than their Neolithic predecessors in Britain. There's a major difference in height. We'd assumed before we had the genetic evidence that this might be dietary, but it could well be that we're looking at incomers of steppe ancestry who are naturally taller. But we're seeing evidence for joint disease, both in the jaw, but also in the joints of the body, which are much greater than those from the early Neolithic. We have a bit of a problem comparing with that earlier period, because from 3400 BC onwards, we're looking at a largely cremating culture, in that we have very few inhumations after that date. So we're really comparing with individuals that lived 1,000 years or more before the arrival of the Bell-Beaker phenomenon. But dental hygiene, very poor. They must have had appalling breath. Higher frequencies of joint disease. Interestingly, there are relatively few incidences of trauma, whether pre-mortem or peri-mortem, and they're mostly male. The most common are what we call the parifractures, so the breaking of the ulna in warding off a blow. And I think we have less than 20 individuals with parifractures. And of course, one of the very few arrow wounded individuals is the so-called Stonehenge archer, found in the ditch at Stonehenge with 3 arrowheads, evidently shot from 3 different directions. Coming back to our isotopes, our carbon and nitrogen, we have a small number of loose, stray human unburnt bones from Stonehenge and Darrington walls. And I'll just flick back and forward so you can see that they plot to the left there extensively. So they are more depleted in carbon-13 than the Beaker population. What does this mean in dietary terms? Well, probably not a lot, because it seems to be part of a pattern that Mandy Jay has identified, in which we have a long-term trend which follows through into the Iron Age, where we move to less negative, more enriched carbon-13 throughout British prehistory. And Mandy's interpretation of this is that we're looking at long-term changes in husbandry and in grazing environment conditions, from grazing under woodland to increasingly open areas of pasture. And what we see when we sum all of the pollen data for the whole of Britain is that that matches very well the picture of woodland clearance renewing after 2,400, and at the same time those species associated with semi-open ground, the ones at the top there, increasing in proportion. Overall then, there may be increased woodland clearance, there's grazing in already cleared areas, and we're also seeing a shift in the animal husbandry. So although cattle retain their significance as one of the prime domesticates, we see pigs being largely replaced by sheep within Bell, Beaker, and later contexts amongst the faunal remains. Milk lipids become more prevalent in pots than meat, and we see the appearance of a new species, 6-row barley, alongside naked barley and wheat, both of which appear to have declined markedly in the late Neolithic, to the extent that wheat seems to have almost disappeared within southern Britain. Even so, arable cultivation within the Beaker period was seemingly not a dominant aspect of the economy. And this is a picture first intimated by Chris Stevens and Dorian Fuller when they did an assay of all the radiocarbon-dated cereal grains and saw that after that decline from around 3,400 BC, it picks up in the centuries after 2,500 BC. Steve Shannon's project looking at using radiocarbon dates as proxy for population similarly identifies a major rise in radiocarbon determinations from 2,500 onwards. And it seems that there may be particular areas which are especially favoured for those earlier Beaker zones of occupation. Certain coastal lowlands, the chalk uplands, and I would say, of course, these are dry, so they're much more ideally used for sheep rather than pig grazing. And then what I suspect may be the spaces within and around monument complexes that could well have been considered as neutral spaces, no man's lands, as opposed to the territorial zones of particular larger communities, and especially the case in southern England, one of those being the Stonehenge landscape. Because it's here that we see a dramatic shift in the settlement area from the end of our grooved wear occupation at Durrington Walls and the whole zone around it marked by the discovery of an extraordinary circle of giant pits. So a shift to the west, marked here in green, on the other side of Stonehenge itself. Two very large areas of settlement. So if you see from the scale that each of those extends, well, the northern one extends several kilometres north to south. I should also point out down here, in this corner, this is Amesbury Archer, Boscombe Bowman land, and we also have a most likely area of Bell Beaker settlement in that zone as well. When we look at mobility, we can see from not just the strontium, but also the oxygen and sulfur isotopes, and occasionally from certain of the carbon and nitrogen isotopes where there's a strong mismatch between dentine and bone values, that we're looking at a likely percentage of movers from all of those combined at somewhere around 40 or 41%. That, of course, is parsimonious, because this is only showing us those that in a lifetime have moved from one environment to another, where we can say that the first environment is sufficiently different from the second. Those that have, for example, moved from one area of chalkland to another area of chalkland will simply be invisible, even though they have actually moved in their lifetime. It's difficult to compare this with the late Neolithic because of the cremation rite, but Christoph Snoek has not only was he the first person to actually work out how we could extract strontium isotope values from cremated bone, but very fortunately for us, he used the Stonehenge material that we'd excavated. And out of this, from the 25 samples he analysed, it is interesting that at least 10 of them had lived in the last 10 years of their life beyond the chalklands. So that roughly approximates to the 40% that I mentioned for Beaker. So it may well be that we're seeing no big change in mobility. But what does that mobility mean? How does it translate into migration, if at all? And I think one of the unusual results of our Beaker People project was the discovery that there were very few individuals that had clearly made long-distance lifetime migrations, and really only 2 that we could point to with any certainty. The Amesbury Archer, of course, and an individual, a male from the Peak District in the middle of England, from a site called Below. This is a disarticulated burial with no grave goods. And the radiocarbon date for that individual is sufficiently late that we know that this has to have been 100 years later than the Amesbury Archer. And it does suggest, and it's only a suggestion, that we're seeing a lengthy period of long-distance cross-channel movement to Britain. It didn't happen all in one go, and I suspect it's something that was a long-term continuing process. We found no major differences in terms of chronology or, I say gender or biological sex or wealth, grave-good wealth differences in our migration patterns. And our suspicion is a lot of the picture we're seeing of that 40% might be largely the result of daily transhumance, pastoralist subsistence. There is certainly no evidence for exchanges of marriage partners of either sex. And there's some slight evidence for particular migration streams. It's interesting that the Stonehenge environs appears to attract people with that have a particular background consistent either with the Silurian and Devonian geologies of Western Britain, or, as in the case of the Boscombe Bowman, that could also apply to Brittany. I want to look at technologies of the body because these have been largely forgotten about, and we effectively rediscovered, in the first case, a practice that had been known to antiquarians in the mid-19th century. And that is that in infancy, there are certain individuals, and it's a small proportion of the total, had alteration of their skulls, cranial deformation, as we call it, which is most likely caused by cradle boarding. And then that technology of the body after death, dramatic evidence for the preservation of soft tissue through what must have been processes of mummification. So let's look at the first, and it's my colleagues Sandra Thomas and Patrick Mahoney in our 2019 volume. And the interesting aspect about this cranial modification, and you can see it's really quite pronounced in these instances, that produces the brachycephalic features which 19th century antiquarians and anthropologists were so keen to use as a racial characteristic for those Bell-Beaker people. What I wonder that is happening here is that this is actually accentuating what they may have considered as a physical characteristic of round-headedness, that we may be seeing cultural manipulation of their physiognomy as an identity marker. And to put this into context, from the same region of the Peak District, from the Neolithic, from the early Neolithic, we have evidence of cranial modification to accentuate long-headedness, dolichocephaly. So it may well be that we have cranial deformation practices which are to do with identity. Moving on to mummification, this was something that we were able first to identify with on my excavations at Clathhallen in the Outer Hebrides on Bronze Age skeletons, but it allowed us there to develop what we call a mummy identification kit, looking in particular at histological thin section analysis to identify processes of diagenesis within the blood vessels of the bone. And one of those cases, the earliest of them, is this one from Canada Farm in southern England. It came to our attention because the very first radiocarbon date that was done on this individual, as you can see, falls in that period before 2470 BC. So it was of immediate interest. We had it redated, the same bone, and by a different lab, and we got a more expected date of 2470 to 2290. There was also some puzzlement about the beaker accompanying this individual, because this particular Wessex Middle Rhine style, we really don't see as starting before the 24th century BC. Though admittedly we do have one example that is associated with a radiocarbon date earlier than that. And then Tom Booth, again, who did the histological thin section analysis, he revealed that this does indeed show those characteristics of an abrupt cessation of bacterial decay within the bone structure. So if that's the case, we now have a reasonable set of individuals throughout the British Bronze Age which show evidence for soft tissue preservation post-mortem, mummification. It's not there in any of the Neolithic samples that were analysed. It's not there in the Iron Age or later. And the possibility is that this could be a mortuary practice which actually has its origins not in Britain, but within mainland Europe. We just have to start looking, and I think we may surprise ourselves. Moving on to houses and domestic life, we have a decent number of late Neolithic houses, and I'm fighting to get published now our Durrington Walls settlement, and here's the main group of houses that we excavated at Durrington Walls for Carsten's Sidestone Press, he says. And I think just out of interest here, we're looking at sub-rectangular structures. They're not particularly large, 5¼ meters by 5¼ meters. Doorways in this instance to the south and to the west. When we look at those houses from the initial early Bell-Beaker period, we have one of those almond-shaped structures that Quentin mentioned in the previous lecture, from Highley Farm, just a few kilometres south of the Stonehenge area. The others that date to this are really rather ambiguous, but it's literally just the three of those that fall within our Chalcolithic period up to about 2300. And all of this data on house plans has just been submitted as a PhD thesis at UCL by my former PhD student, Hannah Bullmore. And she's looked at all of the evidence for houses from the beginning of the Neolithic to the end of the early Bronze Age. But it's quite interesting when we look at her early Bronze Age results. We have over 100 houses, And in that particular case, and this is just a fraction of them, what is so interesting is that there is a marked realignment of those entrances, those doorways, to those that we see in the late Neolithic at places like Darrington Walls. And you can see it is very particularly focused towards the southeast. And really we're looking towards that solstitial direction that we call midwinter sunrise. Moving on to our last topic, monument building and labour organisation. And one of the interesting aspects of this introduction of the Beaker burial fashion is its coincidence with the end of the massive labour investments of constructing huge monuments, where thousands were prepared to labour for an idea or maybe a relatively small number of people directing them. And I think it's worth, of course, pointing out that we've come off that steep part of the calibration curve, and we have the problem of really teasing out chronological changes within this very flat part of the calibration curve up to 2300 BC. But nonetheless, there are enough hints to suggest how that transition to some degree might have proceeded. If we look at what's happening at Stonehenge, stage 2, which dates to somewhere around 2500, so it's before that Beaker burial arrival, Beaker burial start, that is when we see the big sarsen stones going up. So that's when it largely takes the form in which it still exists today. So that we have the sarsen circle, and inside of it the sarsen horseshoe of 5 trilithons. What we see with the Beaker period, though, is the first time that we have ceramics in any quantity deposited within the monument. And as you can see, their distribution is very specifically within the eastern part of the stone circle and within the eastern part of the enclosing ditch. At the same time, the avenue is either built or renovated. The early 20th century excavations were too imprecise for us to be able to ascertain exactly where the dated antler picks came from. And there's a minor movement of 2 stones within the entrance, and also a small rearrangement of those Welsh blue stones in the middle. What is interesting is that somewhere between stage 3 and stage 5, and before stage 5, so probably stages 3 or 4, we see the construction of an impromptu entrance facing towards midwinter sunrise. So the same as those doorway orientations. So this is interesting because it's effectively repurposing Stonehenge and taking the emphasis away from its main solstitial axis of midwinter sunset, midsummer sunrise. It is slightly later, around stage 5, that we see particularly the eastern side of the sarsen circle decorated with a large number of carvings of axe heads, which can be typologically dated to just after 1700 BC. There is a further axis marked by the distribution of daggers. So that line from where we have 1 dagger up at the northwest to the 2 daggers on the trilithon in the southeast, that aligns towards major southern moonrise. The other curious feature that we've never really understood in stage 3 is the digging of a very large pit against the base of the Great Trilithon, which frames the midwinter sunset for anybody either approaching the monument from the solstice midsummer sunrise direction or standing in the middle of it. It doesn't topple the trilithon at this point. It remains standing for another couple of stages. at least after stage 4. But I do wonder if this may have been some act of iconoclasm to effectively decommission that particular solar aspect, that axis towards midwinter sunset. But of course, we also, I think, need to consider whether stage 2's construction was done in the absence of any Bell Beaker presence within Britain, as we had previously assumed, because of the lack of any Beaker burials of that particular date around 2500. My suggestion is that it is actually built at that time as a monument of unification for the very reason that we have different populations at large within southern Britain, hence the need to try and create unity where there evidently may not have been. We then see structures such as Woodhenge. Its timber circle is built in that earlier phase, broadly concurrent with Stonehenge Stage 2, but its henge ditch is clearly later and falls within what definitely is the Bell Beaker period. So we see what is effectively a long-term local tradition within Britain of henge construction being carried on within what is clearly Beaker time. The same goes for many small stone circles, and Richard Bradley's work on the recumbent circles of Aberdeenshire has produced very secure dates that again place them within the Bell Beaker period. And similarly, timber circles also continue into this period. So these kinds of monuments, which would have been alien to those Bell Beaker arrivals, are certainly continuing to be constructed well after any, let alone contact, but certainly arrival. And the recent discovery of the big Woodhenge at Pommelter in Saxony-Anhalt raises the possibility that these ideas may have been transferred back to perceived homelands within continental Europe. To finish off, I want to just have a quick look at Avebury, where my colleagues Josh Pollard and Mark Gillings have been conducting long-term research, not just, and particularly on the West Kennet Palisade enclosures, and looking at their potential relationship with the enormous mound of Silbury Hill. It is huge. At 7.5 million person-hours, there is more energy, more labour invested in that than all of the 5 stages of Stonehenge's construction put together. What is interesting is that if the West Kennet Palisade enclosures are associated with that huge construction event, a construction event that just carried on past its original plan of where they were going to stop, it just kept getting bigger and bigger. But West Kennet's produced radiocarbon dates that are broadly consistent with the period that we now can say Silbury Hill was constructed in. The curious aspect is that for such a late period, well after the first Beaker burials in Britain, the ceramic assemblage is exclusively grooved ware. There are Beaker burials in the vicinity. They're generally quite late within the sequence, and Josh and Mark even found an inhumation buried in the top of one of these palisade enclosures just a couple of years back. So we have the possibility that we have enclaves lasting for centuries within the mainland, within Britain, and that these groups are living side by side. We seem to have exactly the same thing happening, for example, between Amesbury and Darrington Walls, so that by the time that the last deposits of grooved ware go into the rotted out posts of the great timber circles, like the Southern Circle at Darrington Walls, there has already been a settlement of Beaker-users on the other side of the River Avon in Amesbury. So, to conclude, I think one of the interesting aspects is that there is continuity in monument construction, despite a massive a population replacement of up to 90% ultimately. But what is different is the scale. As the Americans would say, no one seems prepared to work for the man anymore, that there's no absolute overarching central organization that people are prepared to labor for in their thousands, that we're seeing a major shift in ideological and political and religious ideas in which there is decentralization, and which a lot of the beliefs, the religion, as Volker has been talking about, is actually repurposed to within the domestic home in large extent, and other smaller structures, so that even the large barrows are the sort of construction that could be erected by a single lineage or an extended family within a matter of months. They don't require the multi-lineage, perhaps multi-clan organization that those previous late Neolithic structures did, culminating with that extraordinary swan song in the form of Silbury Hill. So I'll end there. Thank you very much for listening.